Welcome to Issues of Contemporary Politics with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my dear subscribers and listeners, I have a special treat for you. This program is in the form of an interview which I gave to a program, Legitimate Targets, on the platform of Streamlines. And it is devoted to Europe. And I think it's quite appropriate today because European leaders are in the process of rejecting President Trump's plan for Russian-Ukrainian war settlement. And that brings a more historical question. Why are they doing it? What and why can explain the development of relations between Europe and Russia, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So these questions are treated in this interview, and I take a historical approach. And there we go. I invite you for this interview.
Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. I've got a very special guest joining us on today's episode. Vladimir Brovkin is a Russian-born American historian and author specializing in the Russian Revolution, communism, and Soviet history, who has served as a research scholar at the Wilson Center, associate professor at Harvard University, and adjunct professor at American University. Mr. Brovkin, thank you so much for joining me today. How you doing?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm pleased. Thank you.
Of course. I want to start off by asking you something. I discussed this matter with Michael J. Carley a few weeks ago, and he's another expert on Soviet history and Stalin. And it seems as though if you look throughout history, this Russophobia that we now see today really didn't begin today. It didn't begin in the Cold War, as many American historians will try to point out. Maybe it began far further back than that. If you look to the start of the Russian Revolution, when there was a joint intervention led by Western states, led by the UK in particular, to try and stop the Bolsheviks from really securing and stabilizing power centers in Moscow. What do you make of that? When do you think the anti-Russia paranoia began for the West?
That's a good question. Well, let me try to give you a kind of historical answer. Um, and what comes to mind is that I recently read some. I live in France, and I recently read some descriptions of how the French greeted the Russians when Alexander III came to France, and this is the beginning of the Russian-French alliance. Now, one of the most beautiful bridges in Paris is called Pont Alexandre III. That's Alexander III. This is the one right across from Place de la Concorde. And the tone at that time that Russia was just the best thing possible that could happen to France. There was eulogy to Nicholas II and to Russia and to Russian culture. And indeed, there was really a very, very serious cultural kind of mutual enrichment between France and Russia. Even as late as like 1990s, when I was coming to France very regularly, the French channel France Culture had regular segments on Russian culture. I could never imagine in the United States turning on a cultural program, let's say NPR, and there would be a program on Akudjava or on Mayakovsky or on Bolshevik culture. This was a regular staple in France in the 1990s. Moreover, at that time, everybody was super friendly to the Russians and to me and to everybody else. So what I would say, to answer the question, the origins of current Russophobia, I have two answers of this, the short term and the long term. The short term, there are two sources. Let's remember that when Putin became president, just about every Western leader called him a friend. There was real friendship with Schröder, German chancellor. There was real friendship. Well, at least President um, George Bush called Putin a friend, and the Italians were friends, and Sarkozy and um, I just about anybody at that time. So all Western powers regarded Russia as a friend and Putin as a personal friend. So how did it change? I think there's two sources to this. One is the Baltics and Poland, and the other is the United States after 2003. And I have a program on that on my YouTube channel, Why the US Establishment Hates Russia. Now, I'll start with the first one. The big powers discovered that they have a lot of in common with Russia, and they benefited from investment in Russia, from tourism. Russia, 25 billion in Spain alone. They discovered a lot of good things, uh, old cultural ties, old anti-Americanism together. There was a lot of links between big powers, which means France, Germany, Italy, Spain, to some extent England, but not so much. So, as you recall, when the United States started the war in Iraq, there were three countries that united in a joint opposition. This was France, Germany, and Russia. And this was a nightmare in Washington. This is where I believe the major source of change of American policy to Russia is, and that is that they had a nightmare that, oh my God, we're losing Europe. The Germans and the French and the Russians are like a core of Europe that is now against the United States policy. Moreover, they had a nightmare that the Germans are buying Russian gas and they're becoming mutually interdependent. So the panic in Washington that they're losing Europe is one of the major sources that decisions were made to expand NATO, to start blocking Russian cooperation with Germany, to do this and this and that. And I don't know what exactly. I wasn't at that meeting, but I see the results of US policy turns against Russia beginning actively from 2003. That's one reason. The second reason is that the Baltic countries, they obviously experienced occupation and Stalinist terror. And what I usually tell to my Baltic and Ukrainian colleagues who say, well, the Russians did that. The Russians did Holodomor. They killed Ukrainian peasants. The Russians deported 40,000 Baltic, Estonian, Latvians, and others. I'd say to them, look, that's not the Russians. This is the Bolsheviks, the communists, because they had a class theory that anybody who is belonging to the bourgeois state, policemen, nobles, private enterprise leaders, they had to be removed. And my most important argument is that Russia suffered as a nation more from the Bolsheviks than all of them combined. Because in 1932 alone, there were 4 million Russian peasants. They didn't distinguish between Russian and Ukrainian, just plain kulaks were deported to Siberia to die. And they were deported not because they were Ukrainian, but because they were peasants who didn't like Bolshevik experiments with collective farms. Same thing for Estonians. They were deported not because they were Estonians, but because they were bourgeoisie, because they did the same. The Bolsheviks did the same with Russian capitalists and Russian ruling classes, and they exterminated them all during the Civil War. So this horrible experience of Bolshevism in Russia, unfortunately, these people understood as Russia as the enemy, and they brought these attitudes to the European Union, and they began to, inflate those attitudes. And then, in addition to that, the US policy of anti Russian, and these are the modern origins of a Russophobia that is inflamed in the United States establishment and in the European establishment. And one word about the Bolsheviks, and indeed, after World War I, when the Russians confiscated when the Bolsheviks confiscated the French assets and France lost a lot of money on these loans, there was a very serious kind of anti-Bolshevik strength. But at the same time, there were 2 million Russian officers who migrated to France, and they became a kind of a keepers of Russian culture in France, which was very important because it didn't die. And then they amalgamated, they joined the French intelligentsia, and they became, and Russian culture was even more become close to the French culture. So I don't think that the anti-communist strain significantly affected the French public opinion negatively to Russia. Even during the Soviet Union, as you recall, Brezhnev went to Paris, and the French president and de Gaulle went to Russia, and de Gaulle spoke very kindly of the Soviet Union. So I don't think there was Russophobia uh, during the Cold War. The current hatred of Russians, I think, is a result of these two processes that I described.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe not for the French back then, but the British, maybe they were a bit upset. They put a lot of manpower into that intervention. But I find what you have to say about the especially the modern era um very interesting, because I remember in Oliver Stone's interviews with President Putin, which occurred over a span of several years. But I think in the first or second time that Oliver Stone went to go speak with President Putin, Putin talked about the fact that yes, Russia supported the U.S. in the initial, I guess, operations in the Middle East after 9/11, and both diplomatically they provided cover, if you will, and also provided manpower on the ground. Um, but you say that there was a outcry, I guess, a bloc that was opposed to this. Explain that more to me, because that's a history that doesn't get touched on too much.
Yeah, well, I remember those events very well, and indeed, at that time, I was, constantly between Russia and America with all kinds of programs at the end of the 1990s. Well, basically, the point is that the Russian establishment, including Putin, in the 1990s, were super pro-American. They just loved America. Everybody loved America. You look at the press at the time. There were American advisors with Yeltsin. There were investment, all kinds of things that's exclusively for Americans. Now, Putin continued that because Putin's policy, it was indeed very pro-Western at that time, which invited Western investment, foreign investment in technology, and all kinds of things that he had to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And it worked. And indeed, that was sincere. And this is why when America was attacked on 9/11, Russia was the first country to offer real, not fake, real help, which even included a permission for the United States to use air bases in Central Asia in order to take action against Afghanistan, which was perceived as a hub of anti-American terrorists. Fine. So how do we go from there? Well, what happened afterwards is that it didn't stop in Afghanistan. That President Bush reinterpreted that American expansion has to continue in terms of total control of the Middle East. And this is where the Russians said, no, 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 wait a second, that's just going too far. And the French and the Germans, and generally, I remember the attitudes on the street in 2003 in Europe were super anti-American. I had, as a patriotic American, I had a T-shirt, something about USA, and I had vacation at that time in Italy and in Austria, and people looked at me like, you're weirdo. I mean, you can't just walk around in 2003 at the time of Iraqi invasion with USA. It was a very, very serious anti-American movement in Europe, and that echoed the views of their governments. And this is why France and Germany and Russia were ready to block a resolution allowing U.S. action in Iran, in Iraq. And it's important because even to the present day, this was an illegal war. It stays to be an illegal war because it didn't have the support of the Security Council resolution. It was a unilateral American action, which by international law is illegal.
Moving forward for Russia, I mean, they have had uh, hundreds of billions, if I'm not mistaken, in assets that have been seized, but I guess not handed over to Ukraine yet. They have been shut out of the international marketplace, the Western international marketplace. And maybe people could draw some similarities, some soft parallels between the Bolsheviks, who said we are not going to pay back your loans to the French, the banksters in Western Europe at the start of the Bolshevik Revolution when they took power, and to what Russia may or may not be in a place to do once this crisis in Ukraine is eventually resolved. And that they simply are not going to, they're not going to seize assets, they're not going to seize loans or anything, but they're not going to participate possibly in this Western economic system in the same way that they did in the past. They're going to look elsewhere. They're going to look at the global south, they're going to look east. um, what do you make of that, and do you think that this is a part of maybe Russia reflecting on its past and saying we do have other options in the world, we don't have to be the best friend of Wall Street and City of London?
Yeah, this is again a very, very complex issue because there are two sides to it. On the one hand, there is indeed, and I describe that in my book too, there's a kind of a political, cultural, economic, military, especially cultural break with Europe. And this is significant. I write in my book that for the first time in 400 years, if not maybe 500 years, Russia does not want to be like the West. This is significant because ever since Tsar Alexis, um, Russia, which is middle of the 1600s, Russia wanted to be like the West and wanted to be a part of the West. And I grew up in a city which is a symbol of Russian Westernism, which is St. Petersburg, which is one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, if not the most beautiful. So that chapter is over. Now, why is it over? Is it just because of the Ukraine war? No, I don't think so. It's much more profound. And when you think, what I could cite what the philosopher Dugin is saying, is that it's not because Russia moved away, although Russia did discover much more its Orthodox Christianity, which is quite different from the Western one. But the way Dugin explains it is that the West betrayed Christianity, and that what Emmanuel Todd, the French philosopher whom I listened to actually just yesterday, he's talking about the death of religion in the West. And this is what Todd calls the decline of the West in his famous book. In other words, this uh, gay revolution, this identity politics, this celebration of godlessness in the West is what is totally unacceptable to the Russians and to the many other conservative societies in the East. Both the Islamic societies and the Chinese and the Indians, profoundly religious society, which whole civilization is based on religion and philosophy. So to these societies, the way the West is moving is unacceptable. And therefore, culturally, they were ready for the break. Now, also, this is also made more complicated by the European desire to expand, and to expand to what to be used to be Russia. Now, let me just explain to you. Putin is called imperialist. Russians are called the imperial, blah blah blah. For most Russians, and I speak, I think, for about 90%, Ukraine is a part of Russia. Period. It's the same people. there's no more difference between Russians and Ukrainians than between Bavarians and Prussians, or Schwabs and Bavarians. I mean, they speak different dialects, but they're all Germans. In France, where I live, there's huge difference between the south of France and the north of France. I mean, these are ethnically different people, the ones in the south and the ones in the north, the Celts and the Latins. So, but yet France amalgamated into one nation where everybody speaks French, and they consider themselves la grande nation. Well, the same thing with Russia and Ukraine. Yes, they have a dialect. Yes, it's a beautiful dialect. Yes, they have their own traditions and their own beautiful things. But still, this is where Russia started, in Kiev and Rus. And this is to consider Russia as being a part separate, belonging to the Germans and to the French and to the Americans, is unacceptable to most Russians. This is why Russia could not accept this Bandera revolution, nationalist takeover in 2014. And this is why it's ready to fight. And the reason the Europeans were so eager to defend Ukraine is because they were heated up by the Poles and by the Estonians and Latvians, Lithuanians, who had their grudge against the Soviets, projecting it into the Russians, and they picked up that attitude from the Bandera people, the Ukrainian nationalists, and it all kind of went together into one stream, which is anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, expansion of NATO, expansion of EU at the expense of Russia. And Russia said, no, we're not going to accept it. What was ours will stay ours, and it's not going to be yours.
Today, when you look at Russia, there's three. I'm not Russian, so I'm just looking at this, I guess, as an outsider. But I see three unique phenomena taking place. That being this, I guess, this revitalization of both Stalinization, re-Stalinization, some people are calling it. It's purely aesthetic. I don't think it has too much grounding in actual policy, but there is that happening. Not so much Lenin, mostly Stalin. You also have this revitalization of monarchist sympathies. You have this deep desire to revisit the Orthodox Christian roots, as you pointed out. And then you have the Russian futurists, which is kind of present day Russia. You have the Belosovs, the defense minister, who have this vision for a future Russia that encompasses all these things in a unique manner. What does that say about where Russia is today, especially considering that even the Orthodox, the ultra monarchist strains of Russian society are now opposed to the West? You mentioned Professor Dugin. He has sympathies, I think, for every single aspect of Russian history. He appreciates many things, but he's definitely Orthodox. He definitely appreciates the monarchist times, the Tsarist period. And these are typically, monarchist ideas. These are people who used to associate with the West and were allied with the West against Bolsheviks. But now it's all moving in a sovereigntist direction.
Yeah, and these are, you mentioned exactly the three most important trends in Russian society, and it is very hard to say which one is which. One could also say that there's another one, which is a kind of a pro-Western, pro-European cultural strain that has not disappeared. There's still a lot of people who hope that one day there would be a reconciliation with Europe, which I don't exclude, by the way. I think that. Just to start with this one, and then I will address all the other three. It seems to me that the trends in Europe are not necessarily guaranteeing anti-Russian stance. I think that's exactly the opposite, because it seems to me that the nationalist trends in each of the European countries are friendly to Russia. If you look at Marine Le Pen in France, they have nothing against the Russians. they are quite friendly to Russia. If you look at Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, it's also not anti-Russian. They're not pro-Russian, but they're not certainly anti-Russian. They have nothing against establishing normal relations. Well, I'm not even talking about Hungary, where nationalism is pro-Russian. And in Italy too, the Italians are stalling on a lot of things that are anti-Russian. And Greeks, they've never said anything against the Russians. And I don't think the Spanish are eager with anti-Russian. So you have all of the Southern Europe, which is not anti-Russian, and you have Northern Europe, which is, Finland and Sweden and England and Denmark. They're like gang ho against the Russians, which, as I said, has historical traditions. But the point is that Europe is splitting in its attitude to Russia and in its attitude to nationalization of power, which is at stake is the future of EU, and is no guarantee. In fact, I am more inclined to think that there'll be a rebellion against von der Leyen and her policies and centralization of EU. And a lot of times people are saying that EU should return to what it was, which is a common market of independent nations. And that's when it can do the best with its own currencies. And this is where I just want to cite one more thing that Emmanuel Todd is saying. Emmanuel Todd is saying that the problem of France is euro. That's how bad it is. And the way he explains this is that you have a situation where currency is joint, but policies are not. And that means that countries can make debts for which they're not responsible, because somebody else in Europe in some bureaucratic office controls the euro. In other words, each country is mounting up its debt now. 120% of GDP in France, 140 in Italy. In England, I don't even know how bad it is, but England is not a part of it. In other words, the problem is that if they could adjust the value of the currency against the performance of their economies, they would have had an inbuilt incentive to perform better. But now they don't. In other words, it turns out that the euro is not necessarily a plus, and they will have to rethink its role in the future of relations between EU bureaucracy and these countries. And that's why there are all these talk about leaving EU, reforming EU, etc. But in regard to Russia, what I'm trying to say, if EU in its current form of anti-Russian hysteria does not survive, which is likely, then we cannot exclude a possibility of Russia having a normal neighborly relations with Western Europe. But it will not be a priority as it was for the last 400 years. The priority is now pivot to Asia. Why? Well, very easy. It's because the longest border Russia has is with China. And the biggest partners that it now has is with India and China and Asia. More importantly, for the first time in history, see, I like historical view. For the first time in history, there's nothing Russia needs that it cannot get from the East. It used to be that you could get things only in the West. No, it's no longer the case. You can get just about anything you want that Russia cannot produce itself. And I mean in terms of technology and chips and high tech and robots and whatever. The Chinese are now excelling in the competition with the US. In other words, the pivot to Asia is long term in a very serious way. Russia is becoming much more engaged and much more interested in trade with China and India and BRICS. However, culturally, Russia still remains a European country. I mean, nobody knows anything about Chinese culture and about Chinese philosophy and China is still very distant. So is India. So there's a kind of a waking up interest. But so far, most Russia and most Russian intelligentsia and educated classes culturally are European. Politically, they're against Europe, but culturally, they are European. And that also is an important factor. But the pivot to Asia is serious. The BRICS is serious. The attempt to create a non-Western payments system is serious. All that is like new realities that define today's world.
I think that is a excuse me. I think that's a beautiful note to wrap up on, and I couldn't agree more with that. Vladimir Brovkin, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm gonna have your YouTube account linked in the description and in the title. Where is the best place though for people other than YouTube to follow along with your work and to purchase your books?
Well, I do have a Twitter account, but there's not much in it. I simply echo what I say on the YouTube channel. So that's the best platform. And the book is very easy. It's Amazon.com or the publisher Routledge.com that has better prices, or BarnesandNoble.com. So these are, do you have Russian listeners in Russia, or your audience is mostly Western?
I think we have listeners from all across the world. I don't speak Russian, so it's maybe a limited Russian audience, but
Okay, I
I
will add to the Russian audience is that there's one book I published in Russia, which is called, in Russian, it's called Great October Catastrophe. And it is in Russian. That's the only book I have published in Russia in Russian. And so people who read Russian and who are in Russia and who cannot get Western published books, they can get that one, which is available at wildberries.ru. So that's the platform that this book is available. Great October Catastrophe. That's all. Thank you so much. I'm
thank
pleased.
you.
Okay.
All right, perfect. Very good.